So first online student here. Flip-flops, obviously not a big fan. You know, lack of stability doesn't really help. In my opinion, you're better off literally being on bare feet than you are with the flip-flops, just because the flip-flops create an instability. If there's an instability there, your body might make swing tendencies to try to stay balanced, which we don't want, right? At the end of the day, you don't want to have to band-aid yourself to make sure you stay in balance. So if he got rid of the flip-flops or put on shoes, probably would be better for him long-term. This is actually how he starts his golf swing, by the way. Is the club elevated? This is like Matt Kuchar, but times 100. You ever see Matt Kuchar with a little bit of the lift pre-swing as a trigger? This online student here has a pretty significant lift. You think that right-hand grip is strong or weak? Very strong, very underneath. So based off that, you think we're likely to see the club face probably pretty strong going back early. What do you think of the rest of the posture? Almost hard to really tell because he's lifting the club so much, right? In reality, if we try to pull this back to really the start of the video before he does the lift, maybe this is a slightly more accurate representation before lifting it. I would argue his pelvis is not that bad of a position. His upper body is not that bad of a position. His arms are very close to him, but I would argue a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's lifted so much. Obviously, if I have the club on the floor like this, I'm going to have a certain distance to the body. If I start to really lift this club in the air, I'm starting to pin my elbows to the side of my body. His spine is definitely on the upright side, and his pelvis, I would argue, is actually sitting a little too neutral as well. Yeah. For sure. I mean, there's definitely going to be a lot of his spine angle and his posture. Everything goes from being more like this to more this way when he lifts. The only difference is he doesn't lift with the club like this. He lifts like this, but then has the arms obviously close to the body, right? So in my opinion, a lot of his setup variables are obviously quite extreme with how he's lifting. The problem is he does this with every single golf swing, and he's referenced to me and several coaches, as far as my knowledge goes, that trying to keep that club on the floor is almost impossible. It feels so static, and it's like the mental yips. You can't pull the trigger back because it feels like stuck. So that, I have a feeling that he developed this kind of change over time of the club pulling in the air to try to just create some sort of like fluid movement that's set up to not be so static and stuck. But at the same time, there comes a point where you're getting rid of maybe a mental error somewhere, but you're creating a pretty strong physical error that I'm not super, super crazy about, personally. I think it's too extreme, if I'm being honest, right? I mean, look how much he pulls this club in the air before he pulls it back. He still has not started his golf swing. That's actually him set up that way. The club is a little bit back, and then you're going to see, so he's still... No, that's actually his backswing. Yeah, so that's not him resetting. That's actually him now creating a trigger for him to start his golf swing. So basically what he does is, this is why I said this swing is going to be very unique that we're going to look at. He starts from a bent over position. He raises everything up like this. And then really what he does is he goes like this and then pulls the club back right away. So it's kind of like a lot of fluid movement that, in my opinion, is beyond the point of creating a positive effect. It's starting to create a lot of negatives. So this is going to be his backswing here. I'll actually play, oh, sorry about that. I'll play it back slowly. So first things first. What can you tell me about his takeaway? And it's not just that the club is very inside. Too much hand depth, in my opinion. His left arm is way too connected to his body at this point. He's actually, funny enough, his leg work is not bad from here. The posture was not too bad. And the leg work in the backswing, I would argue, is actually pretty good up until this point. Slight change in knee flex. He's not over-rotating his hips early. The chest, the right shoulder, maybe retracting back a little bit too much as he pulls the club in. He's kind of doing a lot of this, right? So the right elbow pulls behind him, almost like starting a lawnmower. It's a little bit too much of that motion. And the club is very blurry, but you can see it obviously very, very inside. Now, as he continues to go back, we're going to see where the issues really start to snowball. This, to me, here is a problem. Again, I'm going to continue with a lot of positivity. Leg work, really damn solid here. Love the changes in knee flex. We're starting to see a little bit of a window between the knees because he's starting to open them and change flexes greater. Left arm, way too deep at this point, in my opinion. Lead wrist, very cupped. But, dude, when your grip is as strong as his is, how can you do anything but cup your lead wrist? If he tries to flatten his wrist out, his face angle would look like this. It would never work. So because his grip is so strong, he's got to have a lot of extension to that lead wrist to try to manage the face somehow. Right elbow, what can you tell me about that? Way too far back, retracted behind him and inside. You think this is extreme? Wait till you see the rest of the golf swing here. Check this out. There's the top of his backswing. So, couple of key points to see right away. In my opinion, he reflexes his knees and transitions too quickly and out of sequence. His arms were still traveling back behind his body, and yet the hips started to fire really aggressively prematurely. If it were up to me, I would love to sequence this a lot better. Of course, we're going to talk about the arm structure of the arms. Like, basically what happens is his arms from his trigger, club pulls in like this, right elbow pulls back, left arm gets stuck behind his body, and then to try to manage this shaft, he goes this way on it. Right elbow flies, lead wrist cups a lot. You thought the lead wrist was cupped before. That is peak extension on the lead wrist there. And yet, club face is still shut. So that tells you how strong his grip is, that he's in what I would argue is probably, like, no joke, probably 30 to 35 degrees of lead wrist extension here, and the club face angle is still shut. So that tells you how strong his grip is. In my opinion, too extreme, right? This is a case where this golfer is, all things considered, actually not a bad golfer, but he has so many extreme variables pieced together to try to make it work that whenever he tries to make a change, the whole pattern kind of falls apart, and then he's not able to manage it as well as he would like. So here's the thing, right? The arm structure does this, but the problem is before the arms get up, let's say from lead arm parallel to the top, as they're going up, there's a reflexing of the knees and attacking the target before he actually finishes his backswing. That, to me, puts him out of sequence, and now he's in trouble because now the arms are going to be getting caught behind his body if the hips fire early. It's going to be a game of trying to play catch-up, in my opinion. He got very narrow at this point from where he was earlier. He was actually arguably too wide and too far behind him, and then everything just got this way and very, very narrow. Wait till you see the transition down. What can you assume when a player goes from a very wide to a very, very narrow position near the top of the backswing? What can you assume is going to happen in transition from there? Is he likely to unwind it back into a shallow position or retain the narrowness and momentum and get it steeper coming down? Which one do you think is more likely? More likely to carry that momentum over into his transition, correct? So, if you look at his transition now, you're going to see that he carries a lot of that momentum and steepness. So this is a case to me where hips are back to square. It actually doesn't look too bad, all things considered. They did fire a little early for my liking, but I don't believe his leg work is nearly the biggest part of his culprit of his problems. His hand path actually didn't get stuck behind him. They were too deep early, but then you saw them kind of reroute from the narrow position and kick outwards aggressively. Lead wrist is always going to be very extended because of how strong his grip is. I don't like the lead wrist extension, but when your shaft goes from being this flat to this up and across the line, you're going to retain a lot of that momentum in transition. It's going from too flat to too extreme of a position here, and then he carries that momentum. So here, this shaft is much too steep, in my opinion, and he's going to have to try to find a way to manage how vertical this shaft is. This shaft is not pointing anywhere near the golf ball. It's pointing straight down to his toes because it's too steep, right? We're going to talk about what the order would be to change in a second, but let's keep going. So keep going forward. Now you already see the damages start to happen. Lead wrist is super extended. Shaft is way too upright. Not only upright, I would argue too much lag and too narrow. This is a case of too much lag. The golfer is retaining way too much of this, and they need some width here. They actually need to unwind this lag. That's too much, in my opinion. So what could you tell me about what his head and spine just started to do in transition here? Starting to go up, starting to go back. Usually when that happens, what's going to happen to the pelvis? It's going to kick forward towards the ball, and you're going to see him start to come out of the shot because he has to find a way to shallow out this narrow steepness that he has. If he was here and wider, he can just retain it and go there. But when you're steep and this narrow, you got to shallow it out somehow. If he shallows the club this late into the downswing, do you think his path is likely to be too far right or too far left? Too far right. Because he is dropping it behind him at the last second. You drop it behind you here, you can get it back in front of you. You drop it behind it this late into the downswing, there's no way you can get that club back in front of you. You're almost always going to get it too shallow when you're shallowing a steep club this late into the pattern. So his attack angle is almost level, if not up on the golf ball, and his path can get to double digits to the right because of this right here. There's his reaction. You have a student who does almost the same thing? Yeah, of course. But believe it or not, this is a very common good player's problem. There's a lot of extremes in what we're watching of how he created the pattern, but this is a good player's problem. Bad players would take that steepness and just turn on it and cut across the ball, sky their driver because they're hitting way too down on it, and they would be double digits across it. He's a player who has enough athleticism where he's reacting to the steepness. The problem is when you react to that much steepness, that late into the downswing, you can hit a shit ton of shanks, excuse my language, which his tendency is certainly on the heel side. And if you don't hit a bunch of shanks, you can't get off your back foot and you're stuck. And then he ends up there. Look at his finish. He's getting off that back foot way too late. It's too late. The damage is already done. Basically, he reacted this way, and then arms follow through, and then he's playing catch up to finish. So let's reset. How would you approach such a unique player like this? I'll tell you what I would do. You can try as much as you want to clean up the setup. I am always in favor of fluid movement and not being too static at setup. I do believe being too static is a fault, in my opinion, of a lot of players. But there comes a point where too much movement makes it hard to be consistent with where your starting point even is. If I'm going back and forth and my club's in the air and I'm doing all these things before I start back, I have no idea where this club's going to be when I start it back. I can't guarantee I hit the same flow of movement every single time. Sometimes the shaft might be higher. Sometimes it might be lower. Sometimes I have more radial if I picked it up too early before. Sometimes I'm going to be lower and wider. We need some form of consistency here. We need to actually create a little bit more of a static change in this scenario. So I would love for a player like this to just be a little bit more bent over, a little bit more weight towards the toes, not so upright and stuck, right? From there, do we like this? Do we like that? I have posted about Jeremy Paul how many times with his inside takeaway? A bunch, right? The one thing I have always said, and I always stand by this rule, if the takeaway is very inside, but it does not negatively affect the top of the backswing or the transition down, there is no reason to change it. If there is a reason to change a shitty inside takeaway, should we not change it? We should. So there are cases where takeaways can be inside and not be penalizing. There are cases where they are. This is a case where it is. He gets the arms and clubs so far back behind him here, he has to stand it up and be narrow. And the problem is you can't just tell him, hey, you're here at the top of the backswing, try to be there, because he's here. How's he supposed to get there? Unless he just like lifts his arms and does nothing, which nobody's going to do. So this is a case where, in my opinion, he needs a lot of width to his backswing. He needs a lot more passive wrist, not so much hinge, not so much radial, not so much cup, wider, right? He needs the takeaway to be a little bit more neutral here because that starts off the chain reaction of his problems. And then he needs wrist to be flatter, grip to be obviously a lot weaker than where it is. And then from there, keep the wrists much more passive going up and wider because he's too much here, right? But the key for him is that you can't just tackle the top of the backswing like you can for some other players. His takeaway is too extreme. You have to change it that way. And then with time, I would probably sequence him to just finish his backswing with his hips to not fire so early. Believe it or not, a player like this is maybe 2-3 changes away from being really damn good. His backswing is his biggest issue, in my opinion. And if you can get the club on, let's call it more on plane for the purpose of the argument, and you can get him a little bit more width to his arms and everything, and you get the grip less strong because it's creating too much wrist extension, you can actually get him into some really good spots. And as soon as he's in a good spot up here, the idea is he won't end up in this spot. He might still have a little bit of that kind of downloading movement. It shouldn't be too extreme though. It's a unique case, but it's one where his backswing, in my opinion, is most of the damage that he has. The backswing and probably the grip just being so severely strong. Let's put it that way. Any questions? I'll repeat it for the video. So you're saying with somebody of an extreme position as he is at the top, yeah? He's very comfortable. He was very comfortable in that position. So as far as my knowledge goes, this person has consulted, I'll try to phrase it in a way that makes sense. He's consulted with several coaches as far as my knowledge goes and has been told a lot of the same information and hasn't quite been able to crack the code yet.
So how do you approach breaking that habit?
The best way to approach that is you really have to tackle one thing at a time. And it's clear when there's a player like that, you see the chain of events that take place that are very extreme. In my opinion, if you take a player like that and you try to tackle all of it at once, they're going to end up feeling very overwhelmed because of how comfortable their extreme nature is of their movement, and they're going to regress or just recycle the same information, can't get it done, go to someone else, go to someone else. In my opinion, this student here that we just spoke about does not need an online lesson on what his mechanical issues are and how to change it. At this point, he has that information. He was given it from me, and he was given it from several other coaches. I mentor coaches online. I have had this student's video be brought up to me from another coach on more than one occasion, by the way. Just, that's where my point is. And I don't want to discredit the person. Like, he's a great guy. He just wants to be better. I respect that from anyone. The frustrating part from him is that he's being told the mechanical issues he has and how to change them and hasn't been able to do it. I believe he needs much more of a work practice plan. He needs a proper roadmap on how to practice to get better, not on what to change. He knows what to change. We see it. It's clear as day what he needs to change. How do you practice to get better? To crack that code, he needs consistent, tedious efforts on the same thing for a long period of time. And I don't believe that that's been the case up until this point, which is why he hasn't been able to change it. He needs to go out there and for 2 weeks, you just get comfortable with the setup and not being so bouncing all over the place. He needs for 2 weeks to just get comfortable with the idea of, let me get the club here. No matter what the ball flight is, no matter where I do, I'll practice into a screen with no visual if I need to. But I'll just get here and there instead of being here and there, right? If you can't get the first piece of the puzzle set up, the domino, you can't change the takeaway. If you can't change the takeaway, you can't change the top of the backswing. If you can't change the top of the backswing, you can't change anything else coming down into the ball. That's the issue, right? So, in my opinion, he would be best not taking online lessons. He would be best being with someone in front of him for an hour who's going to force him to be very tedious with the process. I love working out, but if I'm being honest, I enjoy working out when I have a personal trainer there more than when I don't. Because when I don't, I tend to cut corners. And when I cut corners, I'm not being as effective. If I'm not being as effective, I'm wasting my time. Right? He has all the tools. He has the knowledge. He's got the skill set. He's a good golfer. He hasn't been able to make changes. At some point, you need someone there forcing you to be tedious, or you can continue to take online lessons, which is fine, but he needs to follow the roadmap, and he needs to be really hard on himself to follow that roadmap if someone's going to create it for him. Because if you're going to stand there and the first thing you're going to do is this, you're toast in his pattern. So for me, this is a scenario where he just needs to break it down piece by piece. You master the takeaway first, nothing else. You master the second half of the backswing, nothing else. Here's the issue with a player like this and why I genuinely believe he struggles to make a lot of the changes he wants to make. We spoke about his grip being very strong. When you have a grip that strong, your pattern is built to shut the face. But when you shallow the club as late as he does, what am I doing to my face angle when I shallow it that late? I'm opening it. If he's going to shallow the club that late, he's going to open it. He has the strongest grip and strongest face angle, and yet his miss is to the right. How do you tell a guy like that to weaken their grip and them genuinely believe that they can trust it? The only way he'll ever weaken his grip, he has to do it super slow, super incrementally, and he has to match it with getting his wrist angles gradually less and less cupped, more and more in this pattern. It'll never get here. It won't get here in 6 months, but it has to trend in that direction. And you have to incrementally tackle both at the same time or you're going to struggle. That's what I genuinely believe he struggles with, is the fact that he has an issue because of how he's holding the club, but he can't change it because of how he shallows it late, and he's stuck in that cycle, which is why you have to tackle it piece by piece really, really slowly. It's a shitty, tedious process someone like that has to go through, but they're not going to have a choice. That's the problem. Does that make sense? All right, here is a plus handicap. Great golfer. Do we love the setup? Not really, maybe. Sitting back. Pelvis, in my opinion, is sitting too far back behind him. A little too much knee flex, in my opinion. He's a little bit too much in this direction. He needs pelvis tucked under him more and taller with a little bit less knee bend. Besides that, everything else is okay. Sorry? His lines are really good. It's a unique way to get there, but he got there. Here's the key. Does this person have a lot of wrist set at this point or not? No. Do you remember the trick that I told you guys last time on why they don't have a lot of wrist set? Because by the time the shaft gets parallel to the ground, it's happening much higher. If the shaft got parallel to the ground at the knees, they're bending their wrists a lot. If I stand here and I create a lot of wrist bend, this shaft is going to be parallel really early. If I don't, even if the club's on plane, the shaft gets parallel really late into my backswing. So he's somebody who does not have a bunch of wrist set, basically, right? But the club's outside the hands. Face angle may be a little bit toe up, but it's not that bad, right? Legs, slightly changing knee flex, slightly opening up the hips, nothing crazy. Let's keep going up. So far, anything worrisome that stands out here? Maybe a little bit less hand depth, but not severe. It's not like his hands are disconnected and out here. Shoulder plane really good. Pelvic tilt really good. Knee flex changes. The window's being created. Shaft angle, not too flat. If anything, maybe just the face a little open in my opinion. That's the one thing that stands out for me here at this point, right? Everything else doesn't look too bad. But then, what happens between the P3 position where the left arm was parallel to the top? A lot of arm lift, right? His lead arm got really, really, really high. Too upright in my opinion. Shaft alignments, pretty good. Lower body movements, really good. Upper body turn, spinal tilt, left bend, shoulder plane, all really good. Just face angle, not bad. I mean, lead wrist a little cupped, maybe the face a little open, but I don't think it's severe. It's not wide open. It's not like we see the toe hanging on this side of the shaft. Really just a lot of arm lift. When you have a lot of arm lift, you're not going to likely have a lot of hand depth coming down. So what do you think is likely going to be happening here? Do you think he's going to trend on the steeper side or shallower side? On the steeper side, right? Now, is his shaft steepening or is it shallowing? It's shallowing a little bit, isn't it? Like directionally, the shaft movement's actually quite good. What can you tell me about his lead wrist angle from where it was at the top to now? It actually got a little flatter. Because it got a little flatter, what happened to his club face angle? Got a little bit more closed. So despite the fact that the toe maybe was a little bit up here, and the toe was a little bit up here, his lead wrist went from a slightly more cupped position to a slightly flatter one in transition, which got him to manage this face angle a little bit better. So this is a case where I do not believe he needs to play around with grip, wrist angles, anything, even if at various points throughout his swing, the face looked open, because he got it under control now. But even though the club is shallowing, what's going to happen on the way down? If the shaft doesn't shallow early enough, what is he going to do through the ball? Look at his arms through the ball. Spine gets just a little bit more vertical. His leg work is phenomenal. Love his pelvis action. Love his leg work throughout the golf swing. But the spine got a little bit more vertical. It actually rotates pretty well given where the shaft was. He's a better player and he managed to make it work. But arms extending a little too prematurely, in my opinion. And this is just the byproduct of his spine extending. He's trying to reach for the ball at that point. Now, if your arms extend too much through the ball, what's going to happen to his release? You think it's going to exit low and around him or up and over his neck? Hands exiting a little too much down the target line, right? This is a case where hands were not deep enough. Shaft was a little too steep. Really, it's the hand depth is the culprit, because if the hands were a little deeper, the club would be better. And then from there, to make it work, as he's turning, he's also standing up with his spine, throwing his arms. As soon as you throw your arms, you're going to follow the momentum of the club head, which is going down the target line. So his arms end up down the target line. Guess what you're going to see with the shaft and the follow through after? Pretty vertical, right? It's going above his left shoulder. That to me is too upright of a pattern. But he's a really good player and he favors a draw, so it's fine. He makes a lot of good things happen in this golf swing. What's the easy fix? P3, he was here. Just a question of needing a bit more hand depth, eh? Deeper turn, deeper hands. Here's the thing, okay? Let's have one little last fun conversation for today, okay? And we're going to talk about his P3 position, because he's got a lot of arm lift, right? From here to the top, we saw that. What if this player tells you they already have as much turn with their hips as they can get? So you're removing the ability to turn deeper in order to get the hands deeper. Let's say for the argument, right, that he can turn deeper. How do you get the hands deeper? There's two different ways you can do it. There's one obvious one that you guys are thinking of, and then there's the second one, which we're going to go through. The obvious one is just feel the left arm a little bit closer across your chest. At some point, you can change this relationship to get the hands deeper, can you not? I can keep the left arm away from my chest and turn more to get deeper, or I can not turn more and create this relationship deeper, and that also gets my hands more inside, right? If he can't turn his hips more, you can, in theory, create more connection between his left arm and his chest to get the hands deeper. If that doesn't work, you need an alternative. The alternative to me is you actually have to prevent him from maximizing his hip turn in the first half of his backswing. No matter what a range of motion of a player is, if they maximize it early, I can't get any deeper with my hip turn now because I peaked it. Right? This is like sparking some thoughts for you, James? So, okay. So if I maximize my hip turn from P1 to P3 to here, how can I possibly get my hands deeper? The only way to do it is to shove my arm across my chest. If I feel like that's very restrictive and I can't shove my arm across my chest, guess what I'm going to do to create space, which is what almost every golfer does when they peak their hip turn from P1 to P3. In that scenario, you have to change the sequence of how the hip turn is loading. The best way to do that is not just to keep the hips quiet, because if you keep the hips quiet, you're just going to take the arms out here. You have to actively work on more hand depth from P1 to P2 without the hip turn. Then from P2 to P4, you add the hip turn. And what you're doing now is you're ensuring that in the second and third parts of your backswing, the hips are still turning. Because they're still turning in the second and third parts of the backswing, you're ensuring that because you're turning, guess what direction my hands are going in the late stages of my backswing. But if I peak my hip turn really early, my hands have nowhere to go. I'm not going to shove them across my chest. I'm going to feel stuck. They're going to lift in too many cases. So if there's room to add more hip turn to get the hands deeper, that's an easy choice, always. If there's room to get the left arm a little bit more across the chest, that's an easy choice, always. But there's going to be cases where that's not so easy to do, and you as a coach need an alternative. And that alternative is you have to change the sequence of this. It sucks because it's a hard change to make. Trust me, I've been through it with players, but you can do it. And I have done it with success with certain players. So then you have to work on P1 to P2, hands working a little bit more in and deeper, and then P2 to P4, I'm turning my hips and I can ensure the hand depth. But if I peak my hip turn from P1 to P2.5, P3, whatever we want to call it, I'm not going to keep going here. I'm going to go there, which is what we see with a lot of people. So that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult, is that he's got his hip turn essentially maximized by the time his left arm is parallel to the ground. Because they're maximized, he's got nowhere to go. In the last part of his backswing, they're going to go there. He needs to create space. It feels way too restrictive to shove them across your chest in the last part of the backswing. Some people can get away with it if they're hypermobile. Most people don't have that range of mobility. They're going to end up lifting the same way he does. Make sense? Slightly different. We're going to call it there for today. Easy. Easy peasy. Beautiful lemon squeezy.